Chapter 2. A Young Man of Proud Manners. Mr. Bingley returned Mr. Bennet's visit after a few days. They sat together about 10 minutes in the library. Mr. Bingley had hoped to see the daughters. He had heard that they were very beautiful. However, he was only able to see the father. Mr. Bennet would not tell his daughters about the young man. But they had information from Elizabeth's friend, Charlotte Lucas. Charlotte said that Mr. Bingley was very handsome, and he had a very nice personality. Most importantly, he was planning to go to the next dance in Meriden. The girls all looked forward to the dance, for dancing was often a sure step towards falling in love. On the night of the dance, Mr. Bingley came with his single sister, Caroline, his married sister, Mrs. Hurst, and another young man. Charles Bingley was indeed very good-looking and had easy, friendly manners. Everyone was interested in his friend, Mr. Darcy. He was a fine, tall man. His face was handsome, and he seemed very noble. There was a rumour that he owned a large piece of land at Pemberley in Derbyshire. Later, everyone discovered that he was proud, rude, and thought that other people were not as good as him. Mr. Bingley, on the other hand, was lively and not shy. He danced every dance and seemed disappointed when it was time for the dance to finish. What a difference with his friend! Mr. Darcy only danced once with Mr. Bingley's sister. He didn't even ask to be introduced to any other lady. At the dance, it was decided that he was the proudest, most disagreeable man in the world. During the dance, Elizabeth had been to sit down for 2 dances. Mr. Darcy had been standing near her, and she was able to listen to a conversation between him and Mr. Bingley.
"Come on, Darcy,"
he said.
"Don't stand here by yourself. Wouldn't it be better if you were to dance some more? Your sisters are dancing with other partners, and you are dancing with the only beautiful girl in the room,"
said Mr. Darcy, looking across at Jane.
"Oh, she is most beautiful. But one of her sisters is sitting behind you, and she is also very pretty. Let me ask Jane to introduce you."
Darcy turned around and looked at Elizabeth until Elizabeth turned to look at him. Catching her eye, he stopped and coldly said,
"She is not pretty enough for me to dance with her."
Mr. Darcy walked off, leaving Elizabeth feeling hurt. She certainly had no friendly feelings for him. Mrs. Bennet, who had also heard Mr. Darcy's remark, was very angry. Still, the whole evening passed very pleasantly enough for the rest of the family. Mrs. Bennet was happy because her eldest daughter Jane was much admired by the Netherfield party. Mary had heard herself mentioned as the most educated girl in the neighbourhood, and Kitty and Lydia were always dancing with partners through the evening. Because of this, they returned home to Longbourn in good and happy spirits. "Oh, my dear Mr. Bennet!" cried his wife as she entered the room. "What a delightful evening! Jane was so admired. Mr. Bingley said she was quite beautiful. She was the only lady in the room that he danced with twice." Mrs. Bennet then told him about how rude, proud, and hurtful Mr. Darcy had been. "I wish you had been there to give him a piece of your mind." It was easy, during the next few weeks, for Elizabeth to know that Mr. Charles Bingley was becoming very fond of Jane. Jane, for her part, returned his warm feelings. Because she was busy watching Mr. Bingley pay attention to her sister, Elizabeth was too busy to guess that she was receiving the attention of Mr. Darcy. Though he had looked at her without any feeling at the dance, he began to notice the beautiful expression of her dark eyes. They made her face seem uncommonly intelligent. He was also forced to admit that her figure was both light and attractive. Her easy and playful manner was also attractive. but Elizabeth remained unaware. One night, Sir William Lucas had a large party at his house. Mr. Darcy was standing near Elizabeth when Sir William came near.
"What a pleasant thing dancing is for young people,"
said Sir William.
"One must know how to dance in order to be part of high-standing society." "True,"
replied Mr. Darcy.
"But dancing is also fashionable in other kinds of societies in the world. Even uneducated people can dance."
Sir William only smiled at Mr. Darcy's cold remark. At that moment, Elizabeth turned around, and he called to her.
"My dear Miss Elizabeth, why is it you are not dancing? Mr. Darcy, please allow me to introduce this young lady to you as a very pretty and delightful dancing partner."
Taking her hand, he would have given it to Mr. Darcy, but Elizabeth suddenly stepped back. "Indeed, sir, you must not believe that I am standing here to look for a partner. In fact, I do not want to dance." Then Mr. Darcy tried very hard to ask her to dance, but Elizabeth would not agree and turned away. Mr. Darcy was still looking at her when she turned away. Suddenly he found Bingley's sister, Miss Caroline Bingley, beside him. "I'm sure you are thinking how boring it would be if you had to spend all your evenings with these country people."
"Actually, you are quite wrong. I was just thinking about how pleasurable it is to see such fine eyes in the face of a pretty woman."
"Oh," said Miss Bingley, surprised. "And which lady has given you such an idea?"
"Miss Elizabeth Bennet."
"How long has she been such a favorite of yours? This is quite unexpected. When can I wish you happiness together?"
"Sometimes your imagination is too quick,"
replied Darcy coldly.
"It jumps from high to low, from love to marriage in a single moment."
"Well, you will have a horrible mother-in-law indeed. She will be perfect for you, indeed," said Miss Bingley hatefully. He paid no attention to her, but continued to look at Elizabeth across the room. Chapter 3. A Young Man Searching for a Wife. The village of Longbourn was located about a mile from Meriden, where the Bennet daughters had an aunt. Being such a short distance, they often walked to call upon Mrs. Phillips, their aunt. Recently, the two youngest members of the Bennet family were going to Meriden very often. The arrival in Meriden of military soldiers attracted Kitty and Lydia. Their uncle, Mr. Phillips, knew all the officers. Most of them were quite often visiting at his house. Soon, Kitty and Lydia got to know the officers too. In their eyes, Mr. Bingley's large fortune and wealth meant nothing, since he did not wear the red coat of a military man. One morning, the day after another dance in Meriden, the two youngest sisters were telling their mother and sisters the wonderful experiences of the night before. "We danced every dance," said Lydia joyfully. "We spoke to every officer in the room," added Kitty. Mr. Bennet appeared at the library door without being seen. He was holding a letter while he entered into the room. He said coolly,
"You two must be two of the silliest girls in the country."
"Oh, Mr. Bennet," replied Mrs. Bennet, "I remember very well when I liked men in red coats myself."
"Please, I beg you to leave out the details,"
said Mr. Bennet.
"I do not wish to hear your clever speech on the charms of the military. I want to tell you about this letter. We are soon to receive a visitor."
"It is Mr. Bingley?" asked Mrs. Bennet, greatly satisfied. "Why, Jane, you never said anything about this."
"Heavens!"
cried Mr. Bennet.
"Do you think there is only one man in this world? It is not Mr. Bingley."
"Is he an officer, Papa?" asked Lydia eagerly. "Is he young?" queried Kitty. "Do we know him, Papa?" asked Elizabeth.
He is a gentleman whom I have never seen before in my whole life. He wants to stay here with us for 2 weeks.
"For 2 weeks?" asked Mrs. Bennet. "A total stranger? How strange! But is he rich, my dear?"
Probably not, because he works for the church."
"Oh," said Lydia, sadly disappointed. "He works for the church?"
"Ah, but he will be given property after his parents die,"
said Mr. Bennet.
"He is a young man of expected wealth."
Mrs. Bennet's face brightened. "And is he single?"
"Yes, my dear, he is,"
Mr. Bennet replied.
"But I don't think he'll be able to stay single for long after he enters this house with all of you."
"A young churchman who will soon own a lot of property," thought Mrs. Bennet. Well, I shall be very glad to see him."
"I'm glad,"
said her husband jokingly.
"You are so ready to welcome Mr. Collins to our home."
"What?" cried his wife. She was in shock. "Oh, so it's Mr. Collins, your cousin, Papa. Won't he receive this property after your death?" asked Elizabeth.
"Yes, you're right. It is that Mr. Collins. You should be very kind to him,"
continued Mr. Bennet smoothly.
"When I'm dead, he will decide if you must leave this house."
"Please do not talk of that man," said Mrs. Bennet. "It is not right or correct that your property be taken away from your own children and given to another relative." "Well, there is nothing we can do about it, Mamma," said Jane. She and Elizabeth had often tried to explain to their mother that females were not able to own property. It was the law.
"Perhaps, if you listen to his letter, you may feel a little softer towards him. He says that he feels quite badly about his position. He does not wish to hurt the security of your daughters. He hopes to make up for it in any possible way."
"But how can he make up for it?" asked Jane. "Yes, how indeed?" said Mrs. Bennet. "And you've invited him for 2 weeks?"
"No, he invited himself, my dear."
"La, he sounds like an awfully boring person," said Lydia. Mr. Bennet regarded her coldly.
"I guess you are disappointed. Maybe you would be happier if he wore a military coat. We are expecting this peaceful gentleman at 4 o'clock. Until then, please do not discuss what romantic or financial opportunity he has."
Mrs. Bennet was the person in the house when Mr. Collins arrived, exactly at 4 o'clock. He was a tall, heavy young man, about 25 years old. His manners were very formal, and he seemed very serious. "You are on time, Mr. Collins," she said coldly. "Will you have a seat, sir?"
"Thank you, ma'am."
And Mr. Collins sat. "I hope," said Mrs. Bennet, "that your journey was comfortable."
"To tell you the truth, I hardly noticed the journey because my mind was too busy thinking about my arrival here. To speak directly, ma'am, I greatly hope to meet your 5 daughters. I have heard much of their beauty."
"They are known to be the most handsome girls in the country. It is not surprising, after all. I have had my share of beauty."
"You still do, if I may say so,"
replied Mr. Collins, as he was a gentleman.
"I have no doubt that soon all your daughters will be looking for a husband to marry."
"I strongly hope they find a husband, or no one will be here to care for them. Matters such as property and wealth must be considered." Mr. Collins moved uneasily on his chair.
"You are speaking about the fact that I will receive this property."
"I do indeed," said Mrs. Bennet. She gave a heavy sigh. "It's not that I find fault with you."
"I care very much, ma'am, about the problems my position gives to my dear cousins." I could say much about this, but I do not wish to be too rude.
Please speak honestly with me, sir, said Mrs. Bennet hastily.
You are very kind, ma'am. I will be honest with you. I must first tell you that I am very fortunate because a very important person, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, has taken me under her care. Her goodness has supported me throughout my life. Lady Catherine has advised me to marry.
Mrs. Bennet smiled and nodded her head wisely. How very, very wise, she said.
I am happy, ma'am, to see that you are so understanding. Now I can tell you that I have come here to find a wife.
I am sure, sir, that marriage would add to your happiness.
In truth, ma'am,
said Mr. Collins, very serious,
I mean to choose one of your daughters. It is my plan. Then one of your daughters will be able to keep her family property and father's house.
Mrs. Bennet stood up and stretched out both her hands to welcome him. My dear Mr. Collins, she said, I am most happy to welcome you to Longbourn.